Everyone, what's up? It's Don Huddersfield. There are a few things in British pop culture that feel as permanent as Now That's What I Call Music. It's older than most of the artists it features. It's older than CDs, downloads, streaming, even the internet. And somehow, despite being just a compilation album, it became one of the most successful brands in UK music history. One question about it is, how did it get so big? But a lot of people also want to know, how's it still going in 2026 when the most recent volume only sold around 6,000 copies in its first week? It's time for us to get into how the Now brand became so popular, when it peaked as a commercial force, and why it's still going over a decade after streaming playlists became part of everyday musical life. I'm Don Huddersfield, and this is How Did Now That's What I Call Music Get So Big? If you want to understand why Now That's What I Call Music won the hearts of the UK record buying public so emphatically, you've got to go back to the early 1980s when compilation albums were basically the Wild West. If you bought a hits album before Now, you were pretty much gambling. You'd get one or two actual chart songs and then perhaps a load of filler by bands with names like Laser Cats or the Electric Dogs, because labels could only use the tracks that they personally owned. EMI had some hits, Virgin had some hits, CBS had some hits, but nobody had everything. So every compilation felt a bit incomplete. Even worse, you might find that the album that you just forked out your hard-earned cash for was filled with ropey covers by unknown session musicians. Then, something genuinely revolutionary happened. EMI and Virgin, two labels who were normally rivals, decided to work with each other. They realised that if they pooled their catalogues of recent hits, they could make a compilation that actually had lots of recent songs that people wanted. And so, in November 1983, the first ever Now That's What I Call Music album was released. The tracklist was stacked. It was full of big top 10 and top 5 number 1 hits, and the public went mad for it. It sold over 1 million copies, and this was the moment where the industry decided this was the start of something huge. The secret was pretty simple. Now had the real hits, not sound likes, not covers or even remixes or versions nobody actually really wanted. The actual chart songs that you heard on the charts and saw on Top of the Pops. And because EMI and Virgin had such massive rosters, they could pull in everyone from Culture Club to Duran Duran. It was the first time a compilation album really felt credible. There was a bit of competition from, I think, Epic, who decided to pool their own hits and could include people like Michael Jackson and stuff. But Now was always the most dominant compilation force, and Hits eventually ended. It changed its name a lot, but Now was always the king of the compilations. It didn't include every massive hit, but it did include a huge fraction of them. And so by the late 1980s and 90s, Now would turn into a ritual. There were either 2 or 3 releases a year. Sometimes there was one in spring and one in autumn, sometimes there was one in summer and one in autumn. And eventually, from 1992, there was 3 a year permanently. Kids saved their pocket money for them, parents bought it for their car journeys, and because each volume captured a specific moment in the charts, Now became a bit of a time capsule. You can track entire eras of British pop just by looking at the back of a Now album, including the neon 80s, the rave and indie-soaked early 90s, the Britpop explosion, the girl band and boy band era of the late 90s and early noughties, and also the early noughties club boom, the Ed Sheeran acoustic bloke takeover of the 2010s, and the TikTokification of lots of music since then. Not only did Now reflect the charts, it shaped how people remembered them. Now went supernova when the CD boom arrived before things like Napster. Some volumes sold over 2 million copies. Now 44, which came out in autumn 1999, is still one of the best-selling albums in UK history. Not just one of the best-selling compilation albums, one of the best-selling albums full stop. And once the main series became a juggernaut, the brand expanded into all sorts of different spin-offs, Firstly, there was Now Dance, which started in the 80s, and then there's been loads. Now Rock, Now Love, Now Christmas, Now Disney, Now Driving Anthems, now all sorts basically. If you can think of a popular genre, there's been, well, several Now albums based around it over the years. It basically became the Heinz of compilation albums. As long as you wrote Now on the cover, people would buy it because it was a certificate of authenticity and quality. And things were going really well for the Now brand for well over 30 years. Until streaming, basically. Yeah, downloads didn't really kill it because you still had to pay for those, and with illegal downloads, obviously not everything was always in great quality, and also it was illegal, so stop it. But once Spotify became a big thing, the idea of paying £15 for a CD of recent hits where you hadn't chose them, and you could just go on Spotify or Apple Music and make your own playlist of recent hits to play it on your phone, that really kicked the Now brand in the nuts. I mean, I do it myself. I've made my own alternative version of every single Now album, and plus made extra Spotify Now playlists for the eras where we didn't make a Now, like summer 1990 and summer 1991. So yeah, not only were CDs dying off anyway, but yeah, the whole concept of a Now album really started to die off. They're harder to find in supermarkets now. A lot of people lost interest in the charts and just looked at the Spotify chart instead. I think a lot of younger kids probably think that is the chart, and sales collapsed because people were just making their own playlists of things on streaming services, and so the cultural relevance has faded a bit. People for a long time have been wondering if Now's days are numbered. But here's a twist. Now isn't quite dead yet. It's adapted, and the way it has adapted tells you a lot about how people consume music today. Although streaming is popular, people still love a physical copy of their favourite music, which you can see with a vinyl revival. The numbered Nows aren't doing very well. They're only out on CD. You couldn't realistically put them on vinyl because of the lead times. I mean, by the time they were actually manufactured, the hits would be really, really old, and people would have moved on. And the most recent volume, Now 123, which came out in April 2026, sold around 6,000 copies in week one, which is pretty bad because about 10 years before, just before Spotify became so big, the first week figures were well into the 200,000s. But the brand has a new lifeline. It's nostalgia, specifically for Now Yearbooks. Now that's what I call music. Yearbooks are a bit of a cash cow for the brand. If you take a specific year, the first one they did was 1983, which is the year that Now was launched, and then they make a deluxe collector-friendly package with 4 discs of big hits from that year, and obviously older hits are easier to license than the latest Taylor Swift song or whatever. We still have some licensing problems, but it's only basically the biggest American acts that sometimes they can't get on, but generally I reckon around 90% of the biggest hits from each year are included. You can either buy the standard editions or you can get the hardback book editions with a nice big pamphlet which tells you lots of facts about the songs and gives you lots of trivia and shows the artwork as well. Also, there's coloured vinyl, which doesn't always have all the songs on, but it still looks very nice and it's great for the vinyl collectors. And then there's extra editions with 60 more tracks. We also do vault editions with obscure chart entries and like songs that only got to number 71 or things that were big in America and not so successful here. They've covered the entire 80s, they've nearly covered most of the 70s and 90s as well, and collectors buy every single one. Some people buy the standard versions and the deluxe versions and the vinyl versions. Yes, the audience is older, loyal and nostalgic about their youth, but it keeps the brand going, and eventually you might think that the yearbooks might start covering the 21st century as well. And also, as I said before, because the yearbooks cover eras where the rights for songs are easier to license, they're really cheap to produce in comparison to what you might have expected to pay for a similar thing about 30 years ago, and much more profitable than the modern Numbers series. This is why the brand is still thriving financially, even while mainline Nows are struggling. The numbered series is basically a legacy product now. It might be a lost leader, really. I don't know how much they make from that, and they do have to fill them with things that didn't even make the Radio 2C list, but it would be really sad to see it go. They had licensing problems, but not only that, they struggle with the fact that there aren't that many big chart hits to go around. But they have to keep the tradition going because it's what the brand was built around in the first place. But for now, Yearbooks are where the real money is. And there's some really good trivia behind all of this. The numbered nows have sold over 110 million copies in the UK. Robbie Williams has appeared on more nows than any other artist, apparently 38 times, and that's before you even think about the take that stuff. The first now on compact disc was Now 4 in 1984. Some of the first few editions had a famous pig on them, and the early adverts had the voice of iconic Yorkshireman Brian Glover. Some nows were even released on mini discs for a few years. This brand has reinvented itself more times than most artists ever do. They might have closed this series in other countries, including the United States of America, but it looks like it's going to be going for a while in the UK. So will the numbered nows exist within a few years? Well, right now, as of 2026, they're still being released, but yes, sales are collapsing, the cultural relevance is fading, and the Yearbooks have completely overtaken them as the Carver brand. If the numbered nows stopped tomorrow, perhaps the company would barely feel it financially, but long-term, loyal fans would still really miss the chance to buy a double disc selection of various recent hits, even if they have to pattern them out with filler quite a lot. It's unlikely they'll disappear just yet. It feels like there'll always be a numbered now in some form, even if it's just the pop experts that now publishing a playlist. They might get reduced to twice a year, or maybe once, like Yearbooks, but we're still the spine of the brand, even if the Yearbooks are what's keeping them going. So, how did Now That's What I Call Music get so big? By giving the people the biggest songs they'd heard on the radio and on the telly at the right time in the right format. And how's it still going? Because nostalgia is very powerful, collectors are loyal, and the brand knows how to evolve. Even if the numbered nows are fading, the empire that's been built around them doesn't look like it's going anywhere anytime soon. I've been Don Huddersfield, and that was How Did Now That's What I Call Music Get So Big? Please subscribe if you like deep dives into the things British people love, and I'll see you next time.